Hi everyone and welcome to the Merlin's Magic Workshop. My name is Jeremy and today we continue our series how to paint Space Marine in the style of simplified NMM, this time with the yellow scheme. In last videos I explained my painting process for blue, green and red schemes. For the red I use a slightly different approach to overcome the problem of translucent paint and also to avoid shifting the scheme to pink or orange when working on the light tones. Today we are going to work with another color, yellow, but we will largely reuse the techniques we have seen in the red video. With yellow, we won't have troubles building the light tones because this color works fine when mixed with white. However, there are some traps we should avoid when working on the dark tones, especially this greenish effect that can appear when mixing yellow with some dark colors or with black. The other problem with yellow, which we also have in red, orange or even some purples, is the translucency of the paint. But as mentioned in the red tutorial, instead of fighting against this property of the paint itself, better to use it to our advantage, for example by working with glaze consistency to build saturation and give power to the color scheme. So today I will show you all my techniques to paint a non-metallic yellow and to obtain this result. As usual, I will first show you all the details of the process on the right leg, so roughly in the first 15 minutes of the video, and then I will go more quickly over the rest of the miniature. If you like this kind of tutorials and if you want me to make more, please like this one, subscribe to the channel and share it around you. You can also join me on Patreon by clicking on the link just below, which will also give you access to a new Discord server where we can talk about miniature and share our pictures of our paint jobs. And of course, you can follow my work on Instagram with the link that will appear right here. Alright, so let's get started with the painting process, and as usual, I will catch you at the end for a last comment. Enjoy the video and see you just after. So for what concerns the color scheme, I will start with the base of heavy brown, a nice desaturated brown with good coverage. For the middle tone, I will use heavy gold brown, which will help to enrich the palette and drag it to the yellow tone. And for the light tones, I'm going for pale yellow. Those three paints work very well together, which makes the gradation process much easier. However, since these are relatively flat colors, I will also use yellow ink to resaturate the scheme. And then I will bring a bit of warmth to the shadows using hot orange. Finally, I will build the highlights with a mix of pale yellow and white to increase the overall contrast. Now that the color scheme is defined, I can show you the painting process starting with the right leg. So, for the starting point, I will apply a base coat of heavy brown. I do it with an airbrush, but this paint is also very easy to apply with a brush. Then I will lock in the primary reflections with heavy gold brown. As for the previous episodes of this series, I choose the zenithal light configuration, so the source is located far away above the miniature. Primary reflections, which actually helps to determine where the light source is located, are therefore placed on the top of each section of the leg. And I try as much as possible to draw a line of light from the top of the leg to the tip of the foot, to ensure the continuity and the consistency of the reflections. As I mentioned in the introduction, yellow paints are generally very translucent. Here I don't use pure yellow but heavy gold brown, which is in the extra opaque range of Vallejo, so with a decent pigment concentration. But still, it's mostly yellow, so we still need to apply at least 4 layers in order to get a uniform and opaque result. After that, I will increase the highlight for the primary reflections using pale yellow. Same places as before, but this time covering smaller areas. For the moment, I only use the basic layering technique to build up the gradation. The goal is to quickly establish the color scheme, and I will come back later with other techniques to smooth out the transitions. This is what I call the staircase gradation process. First, I roughly sketch the different layers of light, so I can quickly see the overall result, and then I blend the transitions to create the final render. I then move to the secondary reflections and I will use the exact same colors to create the gradient. Secondary reflections represent the light that comes from the environment of the miniature, mostly from the ground. Thus, I place the reflections on the interior of the leg and towards the floor, but I still try to maintain the concept of line of light to ensure the light consistency. Finally, I work on the tertiary reflection, still using the same colors and the same techniques as before. Tertiary reflections are generated from the light that bounced on the miniature, so mainly coming from the primary and the secondary lights. I am placing those reflections in the areas of the armor that are facing light spots that I painted earlier. When all the lights are in place and all the staircase gradations are done, I can start the blending process. To create a smooth transition, I go for the fat glaze technique, which corresponds to a paint consistency between the glaze and the layer. The goal is to pull the paint from one zone to another to blur out the transition. But since it's still a semi-transparent consistency, we need to be careful with the direction in which we pull or push the paint. In general, there is much less pigment left at the beginning of the stroke and much more at the end of the movement when we take off the brush. So if my brush is loaded with the color number 2, for example, better to end the brush stroke in the zone number 2, not to leave any visible marks. The main idea is to pull the pigments by following small diagonals from zone number 1 to zone number 2, having paint number 2 on the brush. Then, with the brush loaded with paint number 1, I pull the pigment to zone number 1, but this time following the opposite diagonal to minimize the creation of visible strokes. I will repeat the same process 2 or 3 times until the transition line has almost disappeared. Finally, I will apply a standard glaze, so more diluted than for the fat glaze, over the entire transition. First with the color 1 towards zone number 1, and then with color 2 towards zone number 2. Since yellow is a translucent paint, it's very convenient to use as a glaze or as a fat glaze, where the goal is to get a semi-transparent layer to create a color filter. In that case, no need to add a lot of water to get the right consistency. Generally, I don't like to thin down the paint too much. The more water we add, the more we lose the interesting mechanical properties of the paint. It becomes less pleasant to apply and it's easier to leave brush strokes. The acrylic component in our paints brings the necessary viscosity to help dragging the paint over the surface of the miniature and to allow the pigment, those tiny solid particles of color, to rearrange themselves in a smooth and uniform way before the acrylic medium can evaporate. If there is too much water in the mix, we lose this kind of lubricant property of the acrylic and so the pigment won't be able to spread uniformly. Though, even if I don't thin down my paint too much, I use very little amount of paint at a time and my brush is always a bit wet so that I can easily pull the pigments and get a nice and thin coat of paint. I then move to the lining step. First, I apply heavy gold brown on all the edges. Then, with pale yellow, I go only over the edges oriented towards the top. Finally, with a mix of pale yellow and white, I push the highlights on the edges near the light spots I painted earlier. For the next step, let's simplify the miniature and consider just a sphere, where we have our primary, secondary and tertiary reflections. Up to now, I created a gradient using colors that are desaturated compared to pure yellow but with a better pigment concentration. So now the goal is to use the overlay technique to obtain a rich and well-saturated yellow. My overlay process consists of 4 steps. First, I do a partial coverage with yellow ink using a very thin glaze consistency. At the moment, I will ignore the primary reflections and apply the paint only over the secondary and tertiary reflections as well as on the shadows areas. For step 2, I add a thin glaze of hot orange in the dark areas to bring warmth to the shadows. At step 3, I go a second time with the glaze of yellow ink, but this time over the entire miniature, including the primary reflections. And for the last step, I will increase the highlights with a mix of 50% pale yellow and 50% off-white using the fat glaze consistency. The resaturation phase, as I call it, is quite easy to establish and it greatly helps to enhance the work that we have done so far. No need to master complex painting techniques, however it's important to know your paints and how much water you need to get the desired consistency. I mostly use Vallejo paints, but it exists equivalent colors from almost all the other manufacturers. Though the concentration of pigment and the way to thin it down might be different, so it's good to practice and gain experience with your own paints. And with that, the Space Marine leg is finished. We will then move to the rest of the miniature. The technique is always the same. First, we establish the simple staircase gradation with the 3 initial colors, and then we smooth out the transition using the fat glaze technique. After that, we will resaturate the color scheme with the 4-step overlay technique to give back its power to the yellow tone, retrieve the proper hierarchy of light, and finally improve the overall contrast. The yellow armor is now finished and I can move to the other metals and the other textures. Let's start with the dark NMM Steel, using my usual recipe. For the base, I use heavy charcoal from the extra opaque range of Vallejo. Then I introduce a bit of electric blue to bring blue tones to the shadows. For the middle tone, I add more electric blue. For the highlights, I will incorporate more and more white to the previous mix until I get a sort of light bluish grey. Finally, I smooth out all the transitions using the fat glaze technique. I won't show all the details for this part because I did the very same in the previous videos. I will put the link in the description in case you want to see more. For the next step, I will use my recipe for the non-metallic silver. I start with a lighter base made of heavy charcoal and electric blue. I then add a bit more electric blue again to create blue tints to the shadows. And then I progressively build up with white for the most intense lights. Actually, it's the very same color scheme as for the NMM Steel, just slightly shifted towards the brighter tones. For what concerns the leather, this time I chose to go for a reddish saturated brown. I will highlight it using bone white, and after that I will smooth everything with a brown glaze. The miniature is now finished. It took me between 8 and 10 hours, but with a bit of practice and good organization, it can easily be optimized to 5 or 6 hours, or even less. Just to summarize the main steps, we first built up a simple 3-color gradation using paint that are not exactly pure yellow, but close enough, and more importantly with better coverage. After that, we brought back saturation by using the overlay technique, so working with glazed consistency, which is one of the main strengths of yellow paints. And then we added a subtle orange tint to the shadows to add a bit of warmth, and finally we pushed on the highlights to increase the overall contrast. The final result kind of works to me, and it's very consistent with previous videos, both in terms of render and also in painting techniques we used. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. In the next episode I will be covering the black and white versions of non-metallic metal, so I hope to see you there, and in the meantime I wish you an excellent day.